must say that I'm a little bit conflicted in some respects because I'm a lawyer. And the interesting thing that I learned about the game yesterday was that Jim Harbaugh, the coach at Michigan, and Urban Meyer, the coach at Ohio State, were both born in the same hospital in Toledo, Ohio, about 7 months apart. Now, my law firm is based out of Toledo, and one of my partners actually represents Coach Harbaugh. So he was a little bit upset yesterday with some of the calls, and he's a very passionate guy. So anyway, so let's get started. So what I thought I would do this morning is just to go through a little bit about some things in Bible prophecy and kind of get just sort of a general framework of a timeline of the way that I personally work through and have spent a lot of time working through. I'm kind of a big guy. Since I'm a lawyer, I'm big on definitions. If you look at legal documents that I write, you'll see there'll be a whole section where the terms that are used in the document are defined. And sometimes those documents might be 200 pages long, single-spaced, and the definition sections runs 42 pages. So I'm big on definitions, so it's just sort of a bugaboo of mine. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a group of people, sometimes called the Maskilim. And I doubt that you've ever heard them because I don't think many people talk about them. But they're a significant group of people that seem to come on the scene in the end times because they have special knowledge. But I'm going to lay a little bit of a framework before I get there. So we're going to jump around. We're going to be in Revelation. We're going to be in Daniel. We're going to be, I'm not sure what else. But the framework that we use, and I'm sure Pastor Brandon's been through this with you, is sort of a generalized timeline of the end times. So that there is coming this period at the end of the age. It could start very soon. It could start this week. I mean, that's how close I believe we really are. Called the 70th week of Daniel. We know that comes from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. There's one of the great prophecies of the Bible, sort of a framework for the end times, is found there in Daniel chapter 9. One of the things somebody asked me this week was, why does everything seem to be happening so quickly? Have you noticed that? Now, I'm sure in my case, part of it is a function of age. Pam and I sit around sometimes and we're watching a movie, and when did that movie come out? 30 years ago, that movie came out. They didn't even have stereo. They just barely had. Remember, you went to the theater and it was like a big deal if it was stereo. Now it's got to be high definition, IMAX, super surround sound, and your seat has to vibrate or you're not happy with it. And things change very, very quickly. And that is part of Bible prophecy. In fact, you might remember that I mentioned this last year, that there is this exponential increase in things that happen close to the end of time. Things will accelerate. I use the example of water filling Yankee Stadium, and how quickly, if you start with one drop and double it every minute, in less than 50 minutes you would fill Yankee Stadium to the rim with water. That's exponential growth. That's what's going to happen in the end times. And so when in Revelation 22:12 it says, "And behold, I come quickly," one of the ways of looking at that verse, according to a friend of mine, is that when things begin to happen, they're going to happen very, very quickly. There will be this increase of things happening. So we have the prophecy of the 70 weeks. We know that those 69 of those weeks have passed. There's a gap now called the church age that we're in. Now, one of the things that I've done in building sort of my own timeline of the end times is I started at the end of the 70th week. Because I figured if I could figure out what happened at the end, then maybe it would help show me how things unfolded. So one of the key passages in determining what happens at the end of the 70th week is Romans chapter 11. It's a great chapter, Romans 9 through 11. In fact, you can look up on YouTube. There was a great up here at Porterville, Calvary Chapel, or over wherever that would be from here. Jacob Prash and David Hocking did an exposition series where they went through Daniel 9 through 11. They did Romans 9 through 11. And they did 8 sessions on it. If you can find it, I'm sure it's out there on the internet. I would highly recommend it because it's just a great exposition of that passage. But in Romans chapter 11, Paul talks about this great promise that there is for his people, Israel. I say then, verse 1, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Would ye not, the scripture saith of Elias, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. So what we'll find in this chapter is that for this present age, Israel, the ethnic Jewish people, are blinded in part. They're not totally blind. There are Jews that come to the Lord all the time. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that more Jews have accepted the Lord in the last 30 years than in the prior 1900. Because it's one of the things that's an indicator of the end times that more Jews are turning to Messiah. I mean, thousands, tens of thousands. A friend of mine tells me that it used to be when you were in Israel, every Christian Jew knew every other Christian Jew. Now there are too many. They don't know everybody else because there's been an increase. It's still small, but it's growing week by week, day by day. In verse 15 of Romans chapter 11, Paul continues. He says, for if the casting away of them, my ethnic brethren, be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the firstfruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. And so what Paul does here is, Paul ties this great redemptive act at the end of the 70th week to the salvation of the ethnic Jews. By the way, Pastor Brandon will come back and clean all this up whenever he comes back and speaks again, right? And I told him I was going to kid him this week that was Phil Hill last week? Yeah. Phil Haney last week, me this week, Eric Barger next week, and then you'll have a guest speaker on Daniel on December 11th. It'll be Pastor Brandon. So my wife told me I could tell that one. But he says, boast not against the branches, verse 18, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. So Paul tells this, the reason why God's turned to us is because the Jews essentially rejected Jesus this first time. And so God's now turned to the Gentiles. But at the end of the age, there will be this turning back away from the Gentiles to the Jews once again. Verse 20. Well, because of the unbelief, they were broken off, the branches, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also not spared not thee. Now look, what Paul's saying is, don't get haughty and proud and say, look at those Jews. We're better than they are. They messed up, and now we have all the promises. And Paul's telling us, don't be that way, because if God gets rid of them, he can get rid of you also. Verse 23, and they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, using the example of the olive tree. The branches are cut off, the unproductive natural branches are cut off, and the wild branches are grafted in. And the natural branches are set aside. Interestingly enough, by the way, and my wife will laugh when I tell I'm talking about things involving horticulture, which is not my thing. The only horticulture I'm interested in is the grass on the golf course. Okay, but it's true that you can cut off a olive branch and set it aside for probably longer than any other plant, and then graft it back in, and that branch will become productive again. And so that's the example that Paul uses to tell us about what's going to happen about the grafting in. The natural branches will be grafted back in. Verse 24, for if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree. So again, Paul's setting the stage here that there's going to be this great national regeneration, national salvation of ethnic Jews at the end of the 70th week. And then verse 25, this great passage. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob, for this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. So, this promise is all Israel will be saved. So the question is, has all Israel been saved? And the answer clearly is no. So when is it that all Israel shall be saved in this timeline of the 70 weeks? And the answer is, and I'll kind of give you the real summary short version, because I have a long teaching on this that I did a couple of years ago, and it got like 20 views, so it's not like you were one of the 20 that watched it, because I probably watched it 18 times myself. But you see this period of 70 weeks is divided into two periods of 3.5 years, times, and half a time. 3.5 years, right here. 3.5 years, 1,260 days. 2 periods of equal time. There's a tremendous amount of things that happen in the middle of the 70th week. We'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. And then there's another period that ends, and on day 1260, my understanding is, based on my study, is that is the day that Israel is nationally regenerated. And I'll show you a couple verses in just a minute. In fact, Hosea chapter 5, verse 15. Now, Jesus tells the Jews, when you see this thing called the abomination of desolation take place, it'll be right in the middle of the 70th week. The Antichrist goes into the temple, declares himself above all that is called God. Jesus gave the command in Genesis 24 that those in the environs of Jerusalem get out of town. When you see that happen, don't even go inside to get a coat. Get out of town. I personally believe that they flee to Petra. I've been there myself. It's a phenomenal place, not too far from the treasury, they call it. They didn't store anything there. It's just people thought they might have. Just down through the path, there's a little crack between the rocks that you walk through. There's a 7,000-seat amphitheater that was built back there in one of the areas of Petra. It even has skyboxes at the top. It's a fascinating place. It covers an area of about 400 square miles. So there's plenty of room there, and you might recognize it from one of the Indiana Jones movies, at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But in Hosea 5:15, it tells us what happens, and what I believe happens, on day 1260, when the Jews are under the great oppression and attack from the Antichrist. The armies of the world are gathered against Jerusalem and the Jewish people. They are staging in the valley of Armageddon. I don't think the battle takes place there. They're on their way to Jerusalem and to Petra to finally get rid of the pesky Jews that have been causing us problems all these years. That will be the main goal of Satan energizing the Antichrist in the middle of the 70th week. That will be the goal. God will supernaturally protect them there at Petra. The interesting thing about that is, by the way, if you look on a map, I've done the math on this a little bit, and it pretty much works out. There's a verse in Revelation that talks about the blood flowing as high as the horse's bridle for a space of 1,600 furlongs. If you go to the middle of the valley of Megiddo, the Jezreel Valley, and take the road all the way down, cross the Jordan, down to Petra, it's 175 miles. 175 miles is, guess what? 1,600 furlongs. The armies of the world will be stretched out through that valley on their way to Petra, and Jesus will return and destroy them, and it will be bloody. In fact, it talks in Isaiah chapter 63 or 66, who is this who comes from Basra? Basra means sheepfold. That's Petra. The town right near Petra is called Basra. Who is this who comes from Basra with his robe stained in blood? So this all unfolds in a very short period of time. So when we talk about things seeming to go really fast, just wait till we get right at the end. Then they will be head spinning with all of this happening all at once. So Isaiah 5:15 says this, I will go and return to my place till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face. In their affliction they will seek me early. What will happen to the Jews at that time is not too different than what happens to us. They're an example for us. It says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Things happen to them as an example for us. And a lot of us turn to the Lord when we're in a time of great affliction because of the peace and rest that we get in the Lord. So that will be what happens to the Jews at the end. In their affliction, they will seek them. Hosea chapter 6 continues, come and let us return to the Lord. And listen to this, for he hath torn and he will heal us. He has smitten and he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us. In the third day he will raise us up and we shall live in his sight. Then we shall know. If we follow on to know the Lord, his going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and former rain unto the earth. And then what happens? They've been nationally regenerated. In fact, what this passage tells us is that Jesus returns in response to their plea. As I think Chuck Missler has said, there is a condition to the second coming. It's the Jews requesting Jesus to come back in the midst of their affliction. And if you want to read a good book on this, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Footsteps of the Messiah, has probably one of the best treatment of these passages that I've seen. So the Jews have been regenerated, and then we know, now we understand what it means in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, where it says, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall in bitterness for him as one as in the bitterness for the firstborn. So we know that at the end of this church age, this is a representation of the 7 churches of Revelation, which have a pretty good picture of each of the different eras of the church that we've seen since the founding of the church at Pentecost. At the end of this age, there'll be this 70th week. At the end of the 70th week, the Jews will repent. Now, this is just, I'm going to go through this real quickly, and if it doesn't make sense, you can get it and stop it later. There are differences. You may find this hard to believe, but in the prophecy community, there are differences of opinion about things. That never happens in our culture today, does it? And if you don't think people have differences of opinion, come sit on my Facebook page and watch what goes on there. I mean, somebody will say, oh, isn't this a pretty little cat? Well, I hate cats, and then it's off. Somebody's got a bone to pick. So there's different terms that are used. I'm not going to talk too much about this one, the day of the Lord. Some people think that starts at the beginning of the 70th week and continues on through the millennium. There are others that think it starts sometime in the second half of the 70th week and continues on through the millennium. Others think it starts near the end. So, there are different views of the rapture. There's the pre-tribulation rapture at the beginning, before the beginning of the 70th week. There's a pre-wrath that happens sometime in the second half of the 70th week. And then there's what we call post-trib that would happen sort of towards the end of the 70th week. Some people refer to the 70th week, and I do this myself, as the tribulation period. Now, I don't know that there's a good verse that says it's the tribulation period, and I'll explain why in just a minute, but that's what people call it. Tribulation period means the 7-year period. Some people, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, and I think this is where Dr. Fruchtenbaum makes a mistake, he calls the whole 70th week the Great Tribulation. And I'll explain why I think that's wrong. Then there are other people that say, well, no, wait, the Great Tribulation is in this last half of the 70th week. So similar to the difference on the timing of the rapture, there's a difference on the day of the Lord, there's a difference on when the Great Tribulation is. And then there's one more term that talks about the time of Jacob's trouble. And so some people think that the time of Jacob's trouble is the whole 70th week. Then there are some that think the time of Jacob's trouble is the last half of the 70th week. So where does this really fall? Look at a couple passages. This is for the time of Jacob's trouble. And this is sort of how I go through it. Now, in Matthew chapter 24, and we're going to get into this in a minute when we talk about those guys I told you about at the beginning, the Maskilim guys. Remember this passage. Jesus, Mount of Olives, Olivet Discourse, his disciples come and ask him questions about the end times. And in verse 15, he kind of gives sort of the anchor point. And he says this, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand." Now, what that tells me that, one, Daniel wrote Daniel. Why? Because Jesus said Daniel wrote Daniel. The other thing you should take from that is Jesus says, go read Daniel. And so if Jesus says, go read Daniel, we should go read Daniel. Because Daniel has the markers, the anchors of what's going to be happening during this 70th week. But it's interesting that Jesus kind of progresses through, and then in verse 21, so he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, stand in the holy place. We'll talk about when that happens in just a moment. Then he says this, in verse 21, for then, after the abomination of desolation stands in the holy place, then there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be, and except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved. For the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And there's some controversy about what it means to be shortened. I personally, to the view that shortened doesn't mean that he makes them shorter, it means that they're limited to the time period prophesied. In other words, if things went on beyond this day 1260 of the second half of the 70th week, no flesh would be saved. Because really bad stuff is coming at that point. So in Daniel 9, he talks about what happens in the middle of the week. He says this, and he shall confirm the covenant with the many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So when does this abomination of desolation take place? Daniel, affirmed later by Jesus himself, says in the middle of the week. So on this timeline, if you go, you see this is my representation of the Antichrist sitting on his throne in the temple in the middle of the week. That is when this abomination of desolations takes place. Okay, so now we have that set as an anchor. And we also know that the Great Tribulation starts sometime after that event. Now let's look at the time I want to establish for you when the time of Jacob's trouble is, in my view, okay? Good people disagree. Verse 3 of Jeremiah 30. Look at the language that Jeremiah uses when he describes a future period. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And these are the words that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. And then in verse 6 and 7, Jeremiah goes on to describe this period, this time. Ask ye now and see whether a man doth travail with child, Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces turned into paleness? Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. And so when I see the comparison, the similarity in the description between Jeremiah's description of the time of Jacob's trouble, a time like no other, and Jesus' description in Matthew 24 of the Great Tribulation, that's why I conclude that they're probably the same thing. That's when the time of Jacob's trouble is. There are other reasons for it too. For example, Jesus doesn't tell people to flee out of Jerusalem until the middle of this week. So if it was a great tribulation before them, why isn't he telling them to flee for their lives? Well, he tells them to flee for their lives because in the middle of that week, things change dramatically. You could do a whole series of messages on the week in the middle of the week, so you would call it. All the different things that happen at that midpoint of the 70th week. It's stunning. So that's why I put the time of Jacob's trouble in this last half. So now I'm going to jump ahead, because what Jesus said was study Daniel. And Daniel's difficult because Daniel has pictures of things that happen in the near prophetic time period, not too long after him, maybe within a few centuries, but things that are going to happen thousands of years later. And sometimes when we look at prophetic passages, they're confusing because they'll say, this happens, this happens, this happens, and then they shall know that I am the Lord. This happens in another passage, this, and this happens, and then they shall know that I am the Lord. The problem with that is that there are, from the way I understand it, there are gaps built into these prophetic scriptures. They describe an event, and then here, that's when it's sort of the accumulation of all these things is what leads Israel at the end of the 70th week to know that I am the Lord. They'll get it progressively along the way, but the national regeneration, salvation of that faithful of that remnant that's going to be saved happens at the end of the 70th week. So let me see. I'm going to jump through here just because time seems to be moving. Okay. This is in Daniel chapter 11. In certain passages of Daniel, there's, it's funny, you get prophecy people together, and it's like getting a bunch of lawyers together because everybody's got a different opinion. And I think right now the reason for that is I'm not here to criticize somebody like Hal Lindsey, who I disagree with on some issues, because scripture, these prophetic scriptures unfold in a real world. Okay, so I think what these guys have been doing, what I've been doing, what Pastor Brennan does, is we look at the world around us and try to say, okay, how would this play out in today's world? What would it look like? And so there is a bit of speculation that goes on, and I don't think that's improper. I mean, I think you got to avoid the crazy stuff. I think you need to avoid things where, I see them all the time, people that, God gave me a special dream that he didn't give anybody else, and I know what's going to happen in the end times. I just think that's very dangerous. And I think as we get closer to the end, we need to be, as a community of believers, we need to be very careful in how we confirm these things and confirm new insights and understanding in the scriptures, because I think, as you'll see, that's coming. The book is being unsealed. Daniel was told, seal up the book until the time of the end. Well, now that we're at the time of the end, we need, I believe, to be sensitive to the fact that maybe the things we thought were going to happen aren't necessarily the way they're going to happen. And we need to be humble enough to say we got it wrong. And that's sort of how I've approached it. I'm probably less dogmatic about things now that I've studied a lot than I was before, because, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the worship hour, it's a crazy world. I mean, did you see what happened in this last election? I mean, who would have ever expected that? I know there's the Simpsons apparently had Donald Trump running for president 15 years ago and all this stuff. And there was actually a joke made at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner about Donald Trump running for president by one of the comedians that spoke that night. But I mean, who really, a month ago, would have thought that things would have unfolded the way that they have unfolded? A lot of people are still reeling from shock. All I'm suggesting to you is that this, I believe, is the way the world is going to be until the Lord returns. Now, that doesn't sound very optimistic. I'm very optimistic that the Lord is returning. But I know there's a lot of really weird things that are going to happen in between. A year and a half ago, June of 2015, the Supreme Court issued a decision allowing same-sex marriage. Now we have people that are born one sex claiming to be another one using a bathroom of who knows what. In just a year and a half. I don't think it gets better. I actually think it gets worse. And while I'm hopeful about some of the things that President-elect Trump wants to do, I also believe in low expectations, because then you'll be happier, okay? My wife is very happy. I don't think she expected much when she married me. In fact, true story, when I took her home to meet my parents, my mom pulled her aside. And so when we left to drive back to Ohio, my folks lived in Pennsylvania at the time, drove back to her folks and, what were you and Mom talking about? And she said, well, she just said that, I seemed like a very nice young lady, and was I really sure that I wanted to marry John? Because I don't really think he's going to amount to much. And I'm like, gee, thanks, Mom. And but it worked out. But I think that any little thing I'll be happy with, but I don't expect much because of the way of the world. And we know, for example, that all of the questions that were asked of Donald Trump, will you accept the results of the election, were never asked of Hillary Clinton, were they? Not one. And so now who's out there talking about challenging the results of the election? This is the definition of hypocrisy. This is the way of the world. We should get used to it. So in this 70th week, this person will rise to power. It may be obscure, unknown person, and he's going to come on the scene. Now, if you accept that the white horse, rider on the white horse, is the Antichrist, when that first seal opens, it says he goes forth what? Conquering and to conquer. The seal doesn't open and the guy rules the world. It's a progressive thing that happens, but it's going to happen in a very compressed time frame. And it's going to be, I'm sure that the people that are on the earth at that time are going to be saying, boy, I never saw that one coming, because it's going to be that quick. So in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about the career of a historical figure from a prophecy standpoint, Antiochus Epiphanes, and it also talks about a future world ruler that will follow sort of some of the same patterns. And this is what happens in Daniel. Sometimes you'll see these prophecies of Daniel, and a lot of times we want to assign them to the past. Like this shows the progression of the major world empires. But then you get to the end of the passage, and Daniel says, and at the time, and this will happen at the time of the end. So passages that sometimes we subscribe to being fulfilled in the past, like Daniel chapter 7 and 8, are actually, I think, future prophecies in great respects. They were fulfilled partially in the past. And it's the same way with Daniel chapter 11. So there's a controversy in the community of prophecy people as to where does Daniel chapter 11 start going and looking to the future. Because it certainly does describe to a T this Antiochus Epiphanes guy. A lot of people think that the break happens at about verse 35 or 36 of Daniel chapter 11. But I think based on what Jesus said, and I'll read the passage here in just a moment, I move it back earlier in Daniel chapter 11, back into like verse 21, 23. But listen to this. Okay, let's just read what the Bible says. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. But he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him he shall work deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers, and he shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. At the time appointed he shall return, come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. It's a difficult passage, I'll grant you that. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. And I believe this is the covenant that he's made that starts the 70th week. We're now moving through the 70th week. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Verse 31. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of the strength, and they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. That is what Jesus referred to. That's why I think that we need to move a little bit further back into Daniel chapter 11 to find out what's going to be going on with the specific man who we know as the Antichrist, the son of perdition. And he's going to break this covenant in the middle of the week. He's going to take away the sacrifice, and he's going to go into the temple and desecrate the temple and declare himself above all that is called God. This is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. It says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. So back to Daniel 11:32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people, this is this Maskilim, the enlightened ones that I've been talking, they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So these people, they're called, the word there is called sakal, And people take it and use the term the Maskilim. There's some pretty good articles and podcasts that have been written about it. And these people are described throughout Daniel 11 and Daniel chapter 12. And some of them of understanding shall fall, verse 35, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So we go on. I'm going to skip over this part of the end of this part of the career of the Antichrist because we just don't have time to go through it. So the question is, who are these people? And I want to go to Daniel chapter 12. Okay. So now Daniel chapter 12. Remember, there weren't chapter breaks back when these books were written. So sometimes there really shouldn't be a break. So in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel now talks about events associated, I believe, with this middle of the 70th week. As I said, there's all sorts of things going on. The abomination of desolation, and here is yet another one. Verse 1, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. You know that Michael is an archangel. His appears to be his duty is to protect the Jewish people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one of them that shall be found written in the book. Talks about the same event over in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, Satan, and the dragon fought and his angels and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And we know that he goes down and literally possesses the Antichrist. Back to Daniel chapter 11. And they that shall be wise, and they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. This is talking again about these enlightened people in the end times that will understand what is going on and what is happening. And they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now, one of the interpretations of that passage, which I accept, is that people running to and fro is look around. Pastor and I were talking about this when we drove up here Friday up through the Grapevine on I-5. Where are all these people going? Where did they come from? It's out in the middle of nowhere, and it's a traffic jam. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And this is indicative of the end times. Look at what goes on in every major city now. There's just, and I'm sure Bakersfield didn't look like this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. You wouldn't recognize it if you left 50 years ago and you came back today. And this is the way it's going to be in the end times. And knowledge increases. I could give you stats of the increase in computer knowledge that would absolutely blow you away. And I remember my first PC I got, 1993. 4 megabytes of RAM and 2 megabytes of RAM and a 40 megabyte hard drive. Well, I carry thousands of times more computing power around in my pocket now than I had in my desktop PC. So that's an interpretation. But another interpretation, though, is that people will go to and fro, back and forth through the scriptures, and knowledge of these scriptures will understand. And I can tell you that I'm seeing this happen. Nobody used to talk about Psalm 83 at all. Now there are books about it, whether you agree with their interpretation or not. People are going to and fro, back and forth through the book, and understanding dead prophetic passages that people thought were dead, over and done with, and they're coming to life again. And so your Bible that you hold, or have in your phone or whatever is literally, I believe, going to come to life in the days, weeks, and months ahead. So then Daniel says in verse 5, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders?" With all these things that are going on, the war in heaven and all that. "And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for what? Time, times, and half a time." This is what Daniel had set the stage for back in Daniel chapter 9. It's what John writes about in Revelation. Time, times, and half a time. 1 year, 2 years and a half year, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months. All refer to the same time frame. And I think as you see this, you see how the scriptures really begin to fit together. "And when he shall have accomplished," the end of verse 7, "to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." So let's just summarize who these Maskilim are that we've been reading about. They're a distinct group of people. They're identifiable. They discern and they possess insight into prophetic matters. In general, in Amos chapter 5, verse 13, it talks about, "Therefore the prudent shall keep silence in that time, for it is an evil time." Psalm 14, "The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if they were any that did understand and seek God." So they look at things generally, they also look at specifically. In Daniel chapter 1, it talks about this. The same word is used, sakal. "Children in whom there was no blemish, but well-favored." And how did it describe Daniel and his friends? "Skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." Daniel 11:33, "They that understand among the people shall instruct many." And it also says that none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. It also talks about the Maskilim being, they give heed to the apocalyptic revelations of Daniel. And I think since they come about at the end time, they'll look at the apocalyptic revelations of the Apostle John in Revelation. They will look at these things, and there will be, I believe, a group of enlightened people that will understand and be able to instruct. Who will they instruct? They instruct the people in the essentials of the apocalyptic revelation. The people are called the Rabbim. It will be the people that will learn and understand are the people who will eventually get saved. They won't get it at first. And I know that the bulk of them are going to wait, but we know that in this 70th week period, there will be people who come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. We know that the Jews at the end of the 70th week will come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And why? Because there will be people here to instruct them and teach them in what they need to know so that they can understand what is going on. I don't want it, this sounds, well, I'll say that anyway. I can edit it out later. And they'll be doing prophecy updates. Can I say that? You ought to get down every day on your knees and thank the Lord for that guy. It is so rare so rare that pastors will focus on this. And pretty soon, I feel like you'll be able to count them on both hands. Now, we've determined at our church we're going to do that. I know your pastor in his heart, I know that he's going to do that. And there are guys, there's Tom Hughes and Jack Hibbs and there are a lot of guys doing it. But they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you see it happening in great movements, even like Calvary Chapel. There are people that are just, I don't want to talk about prophecy anymore. It's doom and gloom. One of the big guys in Calvary Chapel said that recently. It's not doom and gloom. It's what gets us energized and fortified to get us through to the end until the Lord comes from us. Daniel 11, they shall understand, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. The Rabbim. They will turn to righteousness. Another characteristic of these Maskilim is they will turn to righteousness or set right the people. And then the question is, so who are they? Well, a lot of that depends on your understanding of how things unfold. So if you believe in a rapture, the church is gone before the 70th week starts, I believe that the only real candidates for these Maskilim are the 144,000. I mean, they have a role. It's not really well defined. If you believe a rapture happens later, it'll be people in the church that'll be here until the Lord takes us out to instruct to the Jew first and also to the Greek the ways of the Lord and to let them understand what is going on. Because the world is going to be very strange. If you woke up 5 years ago, or went to sleep 5 years ago and woke up this week, today, your head would spin with all that's going on in the world and culture. It would. I don't see how, if unless you were just not paying attention. So at the end, there will be these people that will stand up. And let me just this will be a quick 3-minute bonus, and then you'll be out of here before I need to finish. I personally believe that day, for descriptions in Revelation, that day 1260 of the second half of the 70th week will fall on a day of atonement. There's descriptions in Revelation that indicate that it is probably a day of atonement. And let me suggest to you, if God doesn't do anything accidentally, and if God is going to cause a massive repentance of the remnant Jewish people that are going to get saved, what better time on the Jewish calendar for it to happen than would be a Day of Atonement? It makes perfect sense. In fact, it even maybe makes you understand the 2-day, 3-day thing that's going on in Hosea chapter 6. It might represent sort of an age, like a couple thousand years, and then the third day being the 1,000-year millennial reign, but it might mean just 3 literal days, 2 days and then a third day. And that corresponds, I think, to the Feast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And then I would suggest this, and if you want to look more about it, I did a thing 2 years ago, I think it was, called a Future Hanukkah. And you just type in my name in Future Hanukkah, and it'll come up. But the interesting thing on the Jewish calendar, again, I don't think God makes mistakes. If the Day of Atonement is day 1260, and Daniel chapter 12, it talks about making it to day 1290 and to day 1335. So there's a 75-day period tacked on to the end of the 70th week. I won't go into all of what's going on. But here's the interesting thing on the Jewish calendar. If day 1260 is the Day of Atonement, is there anything on the Jewish calendar 75 days later? You are always in Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Rededication, a feast that the Lord sacrifice or celebrated himself. Now, I'm just going to suggest that if that's the case, maybe that is when the millennial temple will be dedicated in Jerusalem, from which the Messiah will rule and reign the earth for 1,000 years. I think that's how it works out. I'm not dogmatic about it, but it's just something that I've seen in my study. So, pray that we would all be like these Maskilim, who will be in the Word, energized by the Holy Spirit, who will understand and teach others about what's going on. Thank you.